The Norwegian monarch is the monarchical head of state of Norway, which is a constitutional and hereditary monarchy with a parliamentary system. The Norwegian monarchy can trace its line back to the reign of Harald Fairhair and the previous petty kingdoms which were united to form Norway. It has been in unions with both Sweden and Denmark for long periods. The present sovereign is King Harald V, who has reigned since the 17th of January 1991, succeeding his father, Olav V. The heir apparent is his only son, Crown Prince Haakon. The Crown Prince undertakes various public ceremonial functions, as does the King's wife, Queen Sonja. The Crown Prince also acts as regent in the King's absence. There are several other members of the royal family, including the King's daughter, her children and siblings. The royal house is a branch of the Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Luxembourg branch of the House of Oldenburg, originally from Schleswig-Holstein in Germany, the same royal house as the Danish and former Greek royal families. Whilst the Constitution of Norway grants important executive powers to the king, these are almost always exercised by the Council of State in the name of the king. Formally, the king appoints the government according to his own judgment, but parliamentary practice has been in place since 1884. Constitutional practice has replaced the meaning of the word king in most articles of the Constitution, from the king personally to the elected government. The powers vested in the monarch are significant, but are treated only as reserve powers and as an important security part of the role of the monarchy. The king's functions are mainly ceremonial. He ratifies laws and royal resolutions, receives and sends envoys from and to foreign countries, and hosts state visits. He has a more tangible influence as the symbol of national unity. The annual New Year's Eve speech is one occasion when the king traditionally raises negative issues. The king is also supreme commander of the Norwegian Armed Forces and Grand Master of the Royal Norwegian Order of St. Olav and of the Royal Norwegian Order of Merit. The king has no official role in the Church of Norway, but is required by the Constitution to be a member. History. The position of King of Norway has been in continuous existence since the unification of Norway in 872. Although Norway has officially been a hereditary kingdom throughout the time, there have been several instances of elective succession. Most recently, in 1905, Haakon VII was elected by the people of Norway to the position of king through plebiscite. In recent years, members of the Socialist Left Party have proposed the abolition of the monarchy during each new session of parliament, though without any likelihood of success. This gives the Norwegian monarchy the unique status of being a popularly elected royal family and receiving regular formal confirmations of support from the Storting, Germanic kingdom. Prior to and in the early phase of the Viking Age, Norway was divided into several smaller kingdoms. These are thought to have followed the same tradition as other Germanic monarchies of the time. The king was usually elected by the high-ranking farmers of the area and served mainly as judge at popular assemblies, as a priest on the occasion of sacrifices, and as a military leader in time of war. Harald Fairhair was the first king of Norway. The date of the first formation of a unified Norwegian kingdom is set as 872, when he defeated the last petty kings who resisted him at the Battle of Hafrsfjord. However, the consolidation of his power took many years. The boundaries of Fairhair's kingdom were not identical to those of present-day Norway, and upon his death the kingship was shared among his sons. Some historians emphasize the actual monarchical control over the country and assert that Olav II, alias St. Olaf, who reigned from 1015 to 1028, was the first king to control the entire country. Olaf is generally held to have been the driving force behind Norway's final conversion to Christianity. Furthermore, he was in 1031 revered as Rex Perpetuus Norvegiae, and subsequently the 1163 succession law stated that all kings after Olav II's son, Magnus I, were not independent monarchs, but vassals holding Norway as a fief from St. Olav. Middle Ages. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Norwegian kingdom was at its geographical and cultural peak. The kingdom included Norway, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Greenland, Shetland, Orkney and other smaller areas in the British Isles. The king had diplomatic relations with most of the European kingdoms and formed alliances with Scotland and Castile, among others. Large castles such as Haakon's Hall and cathedrals, the foremost being Nidaros Cathedral, were built. In the tradition of Germanic monarchy, the king had to be elected by a representative assembly of noblemen. Men eligible for election had to be of royal blood, but the eldest son of the previous king was not automatically chosen. During the Civil War era, the unclear succession laws and the practice of power sharing between several kings simultaneously gave personal conflicts the potential to become full-blown wars. Over the centuries, kings consolidated the power, and eventually a strict succession law made Norway a principally hereditary kingdom. In practice, the king was elected by the Riksråd in a similar way to Denmark. He adhered to a handfasting and governed in the Council of Norwegian noblemen according to existing laws. After the death of Haakon VI of Norway in 1380, his son Olav V of Norway succeeded to the thrones of both Norway and Denmark and was also elected King of Sweden. After his death at the age of 17, his mother Margaret united the three Scandinavian kingdoms in personal union under one crown. In the Kalmar Union, Olav's death extinguished the Norwegian male royal line. He was also the last Norwegian king to be born on Norwegian soil for the next 567 years. The Black Death of 1349–51 contributed to the decline of the Norwegian monarchy, as the noble families and the population in general were gravely affected. But the most devastating factor from the nobility and the monarchy in Norway was the steep decline in income from the holdings. Many farms were deserted and rents and taxes suffered. This left the Norwegian monarchy weakened in manpower, noble support, defensibility and economic power. Surviving the unions. The Kalmar Union was not only made possible by the complex history of the royal dynasties of Scandinavia but was also, among other things, a direct reaction to the expansive and aggressive policies of the Hanseatic League. On the 6th of June 1523, Sweden left the Union permanently, leaving Norway in an unequal union with a Danish king already embarked on centralizing the government of the Union. In the following centuries, the Norwegian monarchs mostly resided abroad. This weakened the monarchical governing structures of Norway. The Riksråd, for example, was gradually undermined as the Norwegian nobles did not have the king's confidence to the same extent as their Danish counterparts. The king was also less able to govern according to Norwegian needs, as the distance meant he and his advisers had less knowledge of conditions in Norway. Norway was one of few countries where the archdiocese was coterminous with the national territory. The church was an important factor in trying to maintain the separate Norwegian monarchy. In the 16th century, the power struggle between the Norwegian nobles and the king culminated at the same time as the Protestant Reformation. This prompted a set of events in which the struggle against Danish dominance in Norway was coupled with the struggle against the Reformation. When both failed, the effects were harsh. The Norwegian Catholic bishops were replaced with Danes and the Norwegian church was subdued and made wholly Danish. The Norwegian Riksråd was abolished in 1536, and more foreigners were appointed to important positions in Norway. The Danish nobles pushed the king to reduce Norway to a Danish province in order for them to gain more control in the election of future kings. However, the hereditary nature idea of the Norwegian monarchy meant that the king had to maintain the basic principle of Norway being a separate and extant kingdom. If the Danish nobles were to elect as king someone other than the next in line to the throne, the union would be dissolved. This gave the king the upper hand in the negotiations for the handfesting. Potential heirs to Norway were present in both the royal dynasties of Sweden and Schleswig-Holstein. So if the King of Denmark did not assert his position as King of Norway, they would. During this time, the Danish kings were more preoccupied with securing the traditionally Danish fringe territories, and therefore paid little attention to and made few attempts at maintaining Norwegian interests. As a result, Jämtland, Härjedalen, Östergötland, Shetland and Orkney were lost to Sweden and Scotland. In addition, all contact with Greenland ceased. In 1661, Frederick III introduced absolute monarchy in Denmark and Norway and introduced new laws in both countries to that effect. Until then, the Law of Magnus, the law meant given in 1274 and 1276, had been the Law of Norway. Christian IV's Norwegian law was in effect a translation into Danish of that older law. 1661 also marks the point when the last remnants of representational local government were removed and had to be rebuilt. However, the process started almost immediately when local men of means started putting pressure on local governors in order to gain or regain influence on local matters. Emerging independence during the Napoleonic Wars, the king aligned Denmark-Norway with France. When Napoleon lost the war, the king was forced to cede Norway to the King of Sweden under the Treaty of Kiel in 1814. It was initially proposed that the Norwegian dependencies of Greenland, Iceland and the Faroes would remain with Norway, but that point was dropped during the negotiations, so they became Danish. On hearing news of the treaty, the Prince of the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway, Christian Frederick, the resident viceroy in Norway, participated in founding a Norwegian independence movement. The independence movement was successful, partly due to clandestine support from the Danish crown, but also because of the strong desire for independence in Norway. On the 10th of April, a National Assembly met at Eidsvoll to decide on a constitution. Norway declared independence on the 17th of May 1814, electing Christian Frederick as king. A short war with Sweden later that year ended with the Convention of Moss. This led to the ousting of Christian Frederick, and the Norwegian Storting electing Charles XIII of Sweden as King of Norway, creating the union between Sweden and Norway. In turn, the king recognized the Norwegian constitution, which was only changed to facilitate the union. The end result was that the Norwegian monarchy became a constitutional monarchy. In this new union, the king was much more a king of Norway than under the previous Danish system. The only area of policy not in the hands of the Norwegians was foreign policy. Norway had been brought along into the new developments of the world as they arrived in Denmark. However, with the break, the Norwegians were able to forge a more progressive political development than was the case in Denmark. Denmark introduced a constitutional monarchy 35 years after Norway. Parliamentarism was introduced in Norway 17 years before Denmark and 33 years before Sweden. The union with Denmark also had its adverse effects on the monarchy. Among other things, it resulted in the Crown of Norway losing territory which today amounts to 2,322,755 square kilometers. Very little royal activity had been relocated to Norway. The country thus lacks the monumental palaces of the period which can be seen in Copenhagen and other parts of Denmark. union with Sweden. The Treaty of Kiel stipulated that Norway was to be ceded by the King of Denmark Norway to the King of Sweden. This was however rejected in Norway, where calls for self-determination were already mounting. A Norwegian Constituent Assembly was called, and a liberal constitution was adopted on the 17th of May 1814. A short war ensued, ending in a new agreement between the Norwegian Parliament and the Swedish king. The Convention of Moss was, from a Norwegian point of view, a significant improvement over the terms dictated to Denmark Norway at the Treaty of Kiel. Notably, Norway was no longer to be treated as a Swedish conquest but rather as an equal party in a personal union of two independent states. Both the principle and substance of the Norwegian constitution were preserved, with only such amendments as were required to allow for the union with Sweden. Norway retained its own parliament and separate institutions, except for the common king and foreign service. The Norwegian Storting would propose Norwegian laws without interference from Sweden, to be approved by the common king in his capacity as King of Norway. The king would occasionally enact laws unfavorable to Sweden. As the Norwegian movement towards full independence gained momentum, the king approved the building of forts and naval vessels intended to defend Norway against a Swedish invasion. The union was nevertheless marked by the Norwegians' constant and growing discontent with being in a union of any kind. The Storting would propose laws to reduce the king's power to assert Norwegian independence. These would most often be vetoed by the king, but as he only had the power to veto the same law twice, it would eventually be passed. The Constitution of 1814 already specified that Norway would have a separate flag, and the present design was introduced in 1821. The flags of both kingdoms were defaced with the Union mark in 1844 to denote their equal status within the Union. Despite royal objections, this was removed from the Norwegian flag in 1898. In 1837, local self-government in certain areas of policy was introduced in rural areas as well as towns. A parliamentary system was introduced in 1884. The royal house of Bernadotte tried hard to be a Norwegian royal house as well as a Swedish one. The royal palace in Oslo was built during this period. There were separate coronations in Trondheim, as stipulated in the constitution. The royal princes even had a hunting lodge built in Norway so that they could spend more private time there. King Oscar II spoke and wrote Norwegian fluently. Full independence in 1905. A series of disputes between Parliament and the king culminated with the matter of separate Norwegian consuls to foreign countries. Norway had grown into one of the world's leading shipping nations, but Sweden retained control of both the diplomatic and consular corps. Although businessmen needed assistance abroad, the Swedes had little insight into Norwegian shipping, and consulates were not even established in several important shipping cities. The demand for separate Norwegian consuls was seen as very important by the Norwegian Parliament and society. The Storting proposed a law establishing a separate Norwegian consular corps. King Oscar II refused to ratify the law and subsequently the Norwegian cabinet resigned. The king was unable to form any other government that he had the support of Parliament, and so it was deemed on the 7th of June that he had failed to function as King of Norway. In a plebiscite of the Norwegian people on the 13th of August, there were an overwhelming 368,208 votes in favor of dissolution of the Union, against 184 opposed, with 85% of Norwegian men voting. No women voted, as universal suffrage was not granted until 1913. However, Norwegian feminists collected more than 200,000 signatures in favor of dissolution. During the summer, a Norwegian delegation had already approached the 33-year-old Prince Harald of Denmark. the second son of the Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark. The Norwegian parliament had considered other candidates but ultimately chose Prince Carl, partly because he already had a son to continue to the line of succession, but more significantly because Carl was married to Maud of Wales, the daughter of King Edward VII. By bringing in a king with British royal ties, it was hoped that Norway could court Britain's support. Prince Carl impressed the delegation in many ways, not least because of his sensitivity to the liberal and democratic movements that had led to Norway's independence. Though the Norwegian constitution stipulated that the Storting could choose a new king if the throne were vacant, Carl was aware that many Norwegians, including leading politicians and high-ranking military officers, favored a republican form of government. Attempts to persuade the prince to accept the throne on the basis of Parliament's choice failed. Carl insisted that he would accept the crown only if the Norwegian people expressed their will for monarchy by referendum and if the Parliament then elected him king. On 12 and 13 November, in the second constitutional plebiscite in 3 months, Norwegian voters decided by a nearly 79% majority to keep the monarchy rather than establish a republic. The Parliament, by an overwhelming majority, then offered Carl a clear mandate to the Norwegian throne on the 18th of November. The prince accepted the same evening, choosing the name Haakon, a traditional name used by Norwegian kings. The last king with the name had been Haakon VI, who died in the year 1380. Thus the new king became Haakon VII, King of Norway. His 2-year-old son Alexander, the heir apparent, was renamed Olav and became Crown Prince Olav. The new royal family arrived in the capital Christiania on the 25th of November. Haakon VII was sworn in as King of Norway on the 27th of November. A new monarchy. The early years of the new Norwegian monarchy were marked by a shortage of funds. The Norwegian state was poor and funds were needed elsewhere than in the upkeep of a large court. In that sense it was a stroke of good fortune that Prince Carl had set as a condition for accepting the throne that he would not be forced to keep a large court. However, the royal travels and the upkeep of the royal residences, after the initial refurbishment in 1905, were to some extent neglected. One example of the negative financial situation is that Prince Carl had been promised a royal yacht when he accepted the throne, but this was not fulfilled until 1947. One important incident in the early years of the new monarchy was in 1928 when the king appointed the first Labour government. The Norwegian Labour Party was at the time quite radical and even had the abolition of monarchy as part of the programme. It was the custom for the king to rely on the advice of previous prime minister in deciding who to give the assignment as new prime minister. In this case, the previous conservative prime minister was opposed to giving power to the radicals and advised the appointment of someone else, but the king adhered to the established practice of parliamentarism and decided to appoint Christopher Hornsrud the first Labour prime minister. The Labour Party later dropped the abolition of monarchy from the programme. During the German occupation of World War II, the king was an important symbol of national unity and resistance. His steadfast opposition to the German demands of surrender was important for the fighting spirit of the Norwegian population. The constitutional powers granted to the king in the Norwegian monarchical system made his position very important and enabled the government in exile to continue its work with the utmost legitimacy. After the war, the Norwegian royal house succeeded in maintaining a balance between regality and approachability. King Olav V was deemed the people's king, and the spontaneous show of mourning from the population upon his death in 1991 demonstrated the high standing he had among the Norwegian people. Even Republicans were among the masses lighting candles in front of the palace. In later years, the marriages of the then Crown Prince Harald in 1968 and of Crown Prince Haakon in 2001 sparked considerable controversy, but the lasting effect on the popularity of the monarchy has been minimal, although decrease from its level of above 90% after the war. Support for the monarchy seems to remain stable around and mostly above the 70% mark. In an opinion poll in 2012, 93% of the people agreed the current monarch does a good job for the country.